Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the last panel of the day. And the topic is Reforming India's Governance and Economic Policy, Evolution and Opportunities. India's journey towards economic empowerment and institutional reform has been shaped by decades of experimentation and grassroots innovation, right from the 1991 liberalization to Aadhaar to a lot of grassroots initiatives. And we have a very diverse and interesting panel. Without further ado, I think I'll just dive into the questions. And my first question is to Dinsha. Acemoglu, Johnson and Robinson very recently were awarded the 2024 Nobel Prize for their theory on how inclusive institutions drive prosperity. And I was wondering, how does that apply to India, and what are some lessons that we can learn globally from it?
All right. Thanks for kicking us off. Thanks to everybody who's lasted through the day, even the ones who are talking in the back. It's great to have everybody here, and I'm particularly delighted to be joined by my fellow co-panelists. So the question was about Acemoglu, Johnson, and Robinson, and poor Shreya has had to listen to me lecture about this reading, all of this work, way too much. She took my global poverty in the law class last quarter. Acemoglu, Johnson, and Robinson, they won the Nobel Prize for arguing that colonialism brought some good things, inclusive institutions to developing countries, and the places where that came into being, where that took root, they argue had longer run economic development. Of course, if you look at colonial history across the board, yeah, you might get some participatory, inclusive institutions, but oftentimes the Europeans that were providing those were killing the locals, subjecting the locals to all kinds of horrid sorts of things, or just pushing them off the land and taking the valuable resources for themselves. So it's a hard argument to buy. In India's case, I think there's a deeper question about inclusive institutions and participatory institutions and whether that can drive growth, right? India has now a 75-year history with democracy. It's been inclusive, but really growth has only been the last 40 years or so. So it's hard to say that there was some magical governing or political sort of change in terms of inclusivity. But I would say that in the last 40 years, what we have seen is inclusivity in a different dimension, not in terms of political participation, but you look at things like education. You go to a village in India now, and 50 years ago, when 30% of the government budget was going to basically the IITs, now you've got broad-based education happening on the ground in rural areas. You take the other extreme, capital markets. How many 100 million people are investing in India now? Those institutions changed in the 80s and 90s and did become much more inclusive. This isn't inclusive political participation, but there is some kind of inclusion that's driving economic growth in a meaningful sense. I think the challenge is how you think about expanding it.
Thank you so much, Dinsha, for starting us off. Building up on that, Sriram, I had a question for you. What Bharat-rooted ideas would shape India's VixitBharat growth story, and how might these guide future India-US relations?
Right. Thank you. Continuing what Dinsha mentioned on AJR, AJR has often been, romanticized as the sort of de facto model of institutional economic growth. So I'm on the camp which is often, biting against AJR. Another example is again Professor Yuanyuan Yang from Johns Hopkins, where she argues that the entire Chinese economic model is based on not just institutions alone. So I'm of that camp in the sense that for a country like India, Bharat is essentially an inclusive, sustainable, it has an essential, intrinsic, inclusive, sustainable way of life. I call it the Dharmic way of life. And that plays a very important role in the functioning of governance and how governance sort of, manifests itself on the ground. So institutions alone don't matter. I think institutions matter, but there is a civilizational undercurrent which drives a lot of activity, especially at the grassroots level. And I think sort of underestimating that I think is in my view, not a great thing to do. And I think that, institutions matter, but more than institutions, I think understanding the civilizational impetus, this way of life is very important. Just extending, to your question, I think the question, probably this entire event should also think about is, what is VixitBharat for Bharat, right? Do you want a rupee version of America as a developed country? Or do you want a developed country which has its intrinsic Bharatiya roots? And I think that's a very important question, because if you look at most modern civilizations, let's take the United States, for example. I mean, the entire sort of modern capitalistic framework is a derivative of the Protestant ethic at some level, right? If you look at the Chinese, if you look at the Japanese, most of them who are superpowers or aspirational superpowers have a philosophical underpinning that drives their pursuit of being a superpower. So this notion that somehow, we can adapt whatever the United States did and then replicate it and cut and copy paste in Bharat or India, I think it's a highly flawed notion. I think we have to come to a consensus or at least a discussion to open up on the traits of what a VixitBharat looks like and then work towards those goals. And I think, speaking of inclusivity and also institutions, which again Dinsha mentioned, you need to also understand that there are multiple Indias within India, right? A large sections of people have various, ways of living. And each of them have their own economic outcomes. And it makes it important, these cultural norms and narratives has an important economic choice, both at the individual level, at the policy level, and also the corporate level. Most of the top Indian firms are all family-driven firms, even today. They might be publicly listed, but they are all, family-driven firms, and they have their own style of functioning. So how do they make choices? These choices are just not bounded by rationality. These choices are bounded by a much more complex paradigm. Unless you understand this complex paradigm, you really won't see how VixitBharat can be achieved, in my view.
Thank you so much for that. And talking about the Indian section of the society, can I ask you, Suhani, how are major governance and development reforms shaping daily life for marginalized sections of the Indian society? And are people connecting with national growth narratives and global partnerships like the India-US initiatives?
Yeah, thanks, Shreya, and thanks everyone for having me here. I just wanted to start first by talking about, like Sriram was mentioning, the three Indias. So it's the Indias in India. So the three Indias, which is India 1, which is, say, 10% of the population, that today owns about 77% of the wealth of the country. We have the bottom 50% of India, which is tier 3, which is India 3, which owns almost nothing, close to 1% of the wealth of the country. A lot of what we've discussed today in a lot of the business panels really seems to come from that India 1 categorization and the India 1 story. How do we develop a $1 trillion business? It's aspirational, we must get there, but all three Indias must have an opportunity to get there. And the current path that we are on, it seems the US path or the path that Silicon Valley or these examples have taken seem to drive India 1 towards that goal. I'm not sure how far that will take India 3. And I think that the realities on the ground, I think what you asked about, there are plenty government schemes that have really benefited tier 3. So when we talk about this specifically, say Manrega, has really, really empowered both populations, men, women, lower income, those in agriculture, those in other self-employed schemes earlier. But during COVID, almost 95% of people went back to avail Manrega schemes. People are highly dependent on them as well. And this culture of welfare state is also creating this sort of dependency that is concerning. And we need to think somewhat beyond that. So we do want to create more local entrepreneurs. We want to think about developing local businesses, providing job-full growth. And I think we do see promise of that, but there do need to be more targeted schemes. And I agree also with, we need an India way forward. And what does that mean? As Indians, you must all know, what do we care about the most? It's not income. It's dignity, respect, status. Somehow it matters more to Indians than to any other class of people around the world. And if that's what we understand, that's what we're striving towards, how can we create an economy and schemes, design these sorts of schemes that actually are designed for people that are trying to achieve higher status, not necessarily higher income alone. That may come with higher income, but also comes with dignity and respect. The way we talk to each other, the way you treat blue-collar workers so that people can actually take up gig economy jobs. The way that we treat anybody, men, women, lower income, different caste people. And I think that mindset, if it starts shifting, that comes from education, that comes from exposure. I wish we can bring more people from India who have never gotten on a flight before to come to this kind of a conference directly, create these pathways for India 3. And I think that's how we can probably get to that $1 trillion company also from India 3.
That was really insightful, Suhani. Thank you so much. I had the opportunity of actually going to India to study these kind of questions over spring break with my wonderful professor, Diya. And there we really spoke to a lot of people about local initiatives. And I was wondering, Diya, how can India balance a strong central framework or policies with local innovation? And where does local innovation come in India's growth and development?
That's like solving the problems for India, and I'm the only non-Indian citizen on the stage. That's the $64,000 question, right? This has constantly been a strain for India, this pull between the center and the more local levels of governance, where stuff actually gets done. How do you listen to people? How do you actually make decisions? We've seen a whole fluctuation across Indian history where sometimes PMO is really powerful, you've got a lot of stuff happening right at the center, and other times you've seen a lot more power either at the state level or contested between different political parties, coalition governments and the like. Honestly, I don't think, at least in the institutional framing we've got, I don't think one is necessarily better than the other. Sometimes you hear people saying, oh, we need a strong leader to cut through all the noise, set us on the right path, push us in the right direction. Again, I'm speaking as an American, not as an Indian. Other times you hear people saying, we have to decentralize, we have to loosen up the power, money needs to be distributed to the states, things like that. Given the current institutional structures, and it's really that sort of dynamic, I don't see much of a difference in those spaces. Where I think you would get something really different is if you start to think really about empowering local government in meaningful ways, putting better bureaucrats, putting better politicians at the locus, sending more money down to these places, really doing a true decentralization. We talk about smart cities a lot in Silicon Valley, for instance, and the importance that it has for India. Can anybody name a mayor of a major city in India? I can't, right? And I study Indian politics. If you think about truer, bigger institutional changes, that would be something I would put on the agenda for India. Again, as an American, we've got our own problems. Please don't bash me afterwards. But respectfully, as somebody who's gone to India for 3 months every year since I was a little baby, this is something I've observed.
Sriram, I was wondering if you have any thoughts on that. And if I may ask another question on top of all of this, where does India's youth come in this whole problem? And what about the youth in the rural sections of the society? Do they also have a role to play? Do they get enough opportunities in India's growth?
Right. There are a couple of things, right? I'll try to illustrate through some examples. The first thing is post-2014. One thing, that you notice with the current Prime Minister, if you really think about it, post-independent India, there have been only 2 Prime Ministers who have lived through poverty. Okay? One was Lal Bahadur Shastri, another is Narendra Modi. Everyone else is in some form, in some privileged background or the other. I mean, they might understand poverty, but not live through poverty, right? So, if you look at a variety of these schemes, all the schemes that we spoke about today, Ujjwal Yojana, Swachh Bharat, you look at, digitization. If you look at a common thread, it's about an individual who's probably spent, 20, 30 years of his life really dealing with the real Bharat. So you're able to understand the power of a light, the power of sanitation, the power of having a house. So if you're really at the bottom half of the population, at least below poverty line, if you look at your life from 2014 till today, it's complete transformation, right? People like us, the middle class and above, the middle class faces, a lot of brunt, a lot of negative criticism sometimes. But if you really look at the real poor, there's been transformation. I think that is because of a mentality of understanding how people, especially in rural India, function. What are some of their challenges? What are some of their opportunities, right? So that's one point. Another point is, again, this modus operandi of how informality and formal institutions work. How does liberalization work? So I'll give you an example, right? So we are 30 years after our economic liberalization that you mentioned. But despite that, 80% of employment today comes from the informal sector, okay? 30 years after liberalization. For all the talk about corporate sector, corporate gyan, investment and all these things, it is still 20% of your employment today, even today in this country, in India. So this notion of, somehow this informal sector will magically formalize and somehow that will lead to development, I think is a very naive notion. Because you need to understand that the informal sector in India is very resistant. I'll give you another example, right? You look at malls in India, right? Malls in India started coming up probably in the 1990s, peaked sometime around 2010, 12. Now they are a depreciating asset, right? Most of the malls have all gone digital and online. But you look at the informal sector, it is highly adapted to digitization. You go to any, kirana shop, they have a vendor which you can use, UPI or whatever it is. They're surviving. I'm not romanticizing informality or small business firms. Eventually, we want them to scale up and become bigger. But I think this notion of some homogeneous way of just formality, and that will lead to jobs, I think is again a very naive notion. I think these are very customized locations. For example, for instance, the Uttar Pradesh government has this concept of one district, one product, which means one village, one product. So any village, there is a particular product that is locally, grown or locally produced, and they focus on that particular product and try to grow, and so I think this sort of an approach, of a decentralized approach, is, in my view, the way towards solving the job problem in a sustainable manner. Because eventually what is happening is you're having opportunities which are available, there's a skill set mismatch, which is one major issue, and then there is an interest mismatch as well. Most people end up doing engineering, but they're not interested in engineering. And most people study things which are supposed to give them jobs, but don't necessarily give them jobs. So I think more, in my view, as we progress more, I think the focus should be on tier 2, tier 3 cities. How do you create economies of scale in these places? And how do you use local trends to scale it up? Because our cities are completely broken. I come from Chennai. Whoever lives in Chennai would know that Chennai now goes all the way till Kanchipuram. It goes all the way till Mahabalipuram, which is basically, 2-3 cities outside. So cities, I think, are, we need to start thinking differently. We need to move to tier 2, tier 3 models, and then expand those economies of scale with intrinsic localized qualities. I think that's the solution, in my view, to solve some of these problems.
Thank you. And Suhani, do you have any thoughts on what solutions could possibly be, how the grassroots communities could not only participate, but also hopefully and possibly lead these kind of initiatives?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, I read a wonderful book that actually Dinsha gifted me, The Digital Nation, that really talks about how, there are two sides of the problem right now. And the solution is also within this problem. So where the problem is that if people say don't have jobs, that's one example. The solution is that there are lots and lots of other problems within the communities for which there need to be solutions that can be solved by those very people, giving them employment and solving local problems. I'll give you an example of what I mean. So say you have a water leakage in your household, right? You need a plumber. Now, ye plumber, where will this come from? So normally you would, we have Urban Company now, you can maybe book one. In a rural setup, in small towns, maybe that availability is not there. But you can have a local person who is trained as a plumber come on demand from that local community. And this can actually be a woman too. If it's somebody within her own community, she's able to get local employment and go to familiar people's homes and be able to get this job done. That's one example. Another example, we can use a lot of influence of AI and technology today, and we can train the technology using local people, employing them in their own solutions. So an example of some of the work that we do, we're trying to create solutions as part of the foundation I run on women's sexual reproductive health. Now, queries like, mujhe operation karana hai, which means I want to get an operation done. Now the technology AI, ChatGPT, cannot understand that what she's referring to is a hysterectomy. She wants to get her uterus removed. But she cannot give more context than that because that's all that she can actually say. The technology has to be able to understand that. How can it understand that? If we train the technology using her voice amongst a million other such voices. Each of those queries that women are using to train the models is a form of providing them with local gig work employment. And that starts them on this stepping path. And in fact, we now have research coming out showing that such types of stepping stone work actually leads these women to do more permanent, longer term employment even outside the home. So these are sorts of solutions that we can solve our local problems, of which we have plenty, using local talent and local people, providing them with local jobs and leveraging technology to do the same.
I'd just like to add something to this. So these kinds of innovative approaches, there are two ways of looking at a glass half full, glass half empty kind of situation. One is to say, oh, this is a problem, we need to address it, come up with innovative solutions. The other is to say there is no problem, right? And we don't need to worry about it. A lot of the ideas that Suhani and my colleague right here are mentioning, in the US, my family lives in Oklahoma, for instance. There's no conversation like this happening about how we lift up people in poverty in Oklahoma, whether it's, to get a half-decent job, what kind of training and things like that should be happening, or even for something more ambitious, right? I've heard more rags to riches stories in my time at Stanford and before that in grad school on the East Coast, more rags to riches stories of Indians who have come from small villages, without electricity, without water, than I have of Americans coming from some rural town in America, from some impoverished background, inner city perhaps, coming to a place like this. So there's a lot more that's actually working coming from India, but the danger is if you just say, oh, it's all hunky-dory, we don't need to look at problems. If there's a solution that's working, we'll give it attention. But, just sort of glossing over it, like I would say we do in America. We have to be very careful about that.
I also want to add just one more point, right? I think we should also understand that policy making should align to the way of life, right? Often what happens is you have a bunch of people sitting in Delhi and they think they understand the entire country. They formulate policy, they try to execute policy, and the uptake of policy is very limited, right? Because there is inherently a particular way of life that is parallelly functioning. If you align policy towards that, then it becomes far more effective. So for instance, right, we just had the Mahakumbh, Kumbh Mela in Prayagraj. I went to the Mahakumbh. There are 500 million people in a particular area. So I had to take 3-4 flights, take bike rides, boat rides, and finally, I went to the Triveni Sangamam. But what I'm trying to say is, people have been doing this for thousands of years, which means the concept of nation state itself is a 200-300 year phenomenon. Which means there is a parallel, track which is driving people to do some of these activities, right? And they affect consumer choices. They affect economic decisions that people make, right? And you have to be sensitive towards this. If you're going to try and implement policy that is applicable in the Western world, but not necessarily suited to the local phenomena, then it's not going to be counterproductive. Because eventually this way of life will supersede whatever that you try to do. Because these people, that's how they've been, that's how their culture is, that's how their thinking is, that's how their actions are. So I think it is very important for policymakers and decision makers to sort of be sensitive about this and not just brush this aside. Because if you really want, one last example is this idea of the success of Swachh Bharat, the scheme by the Honorable Prime Minister. So I come from Tamil Nadu again, where I was in a rural village, which wasn't, I wouldn't call it a Modi village, and if you go to the village, it's fairly clean, except for the main bazaar street. Most of the streets are all quite clean. So I went to a village vendor and asked her in Tamil that, what is happening? What is the change that you're seeing? So she told me that, she felt a sort of a consciousness of protecting her neighborhood after hearing from all the policy guys, for the people who came from the Swachhata movement, who set up all the facilities there, created an awareness among people that this somehow is your collective responsibility. Okay? I call it the dharmic responsibility, but it's your collective responsibility to keep your society clean. So much so that now that vegetable vendor thinks it's her responsibility to keep her neighborhood clean, and it becomes an autopilot. So this is how things work in India, in my view, right? It is not a straightforward one-to-one sort of map between a developed society and a civilizational developing society. There's a big difference. I mean, China is very different, India is very different, and we need to be sensitive to these diversities, is what I would say.
Thank you. Thank you for those thoughts, and lots to think about, lots to work on. But on that hopeful note, please join me and give a loud round of applause for the last panel of the day, but the most dynamic, if I may say. We'll open it for questions, comments from the audience.
Quick question about the informal economy. I was wondering if you guys can tell us if, so the people who are employed in the informal economy, which is a huge segment of the Indian population, are they counted as employed? Are they counted as semi-employed? How do they figure into the data?
Okay. That's probably a couple of hours of discussion.
Okay,
but
you go ahead. No.
Okay. So the first challenge is the definition of informality and formality, right? Just because you're digitized doesn't mean you're formal. Because formality comes with a set of riders in terms of how you financialize, how you institutionalize certain ways the firm is constructed and things like that. So that becomes a challenge. In terms of employment, yes, informal employment is taken into account, but the RBI does a survey. The challenge really is, even for GDP data, beyond the formal sector, the rest of it is all done by a collective group of surveys done by the RBI. So in a sense, it's still an estimate. It's not a one-to-one sort of, it's not like the NSSO survey, which is a very detailed survey which goes, almost door to door into most of the places. So answering your question, the informal sector data is still an estimate, but within that estimate, there are a lot of, nuances, on the definition, on how you also, gather the data in some of these places. So I would say that the data is a bit, clouded in my view.
Yeah, and I was going to add, so NSSO, I think, also includes the informal data, those that are employed in the informal sector, which tends to be still 90% or so of the overall workforce. But I think what we have less clear estimates on is underemployment. So say people are working for 1 to 2 hours in, say, some sort of stitching job or something that is part-time. I think we have much less precise estimates on that, often because it takes a long time to do these sorts of surveys. And time use data, what are you doing every hour, can get to that estimate. And the only estimate we have of that is from 2019. So we can't compare it before or after yet, but more of this data.
Yes, Suhani, do you think 50% of Indian working population is in the informal sector? What's your guess?
It's close to 90%.
Yeah,
90%.
I mean, 80 is an understatement, which I mentioned.
Yeah.
So the Periodic Labour Force Survey, PLFS, is a reasonably, at least from 2017 onwards, they have a reasonable time series now, which captures the unemployment sort of situation. But the informal economy still contributes about 80%. So there's a very good book I think all of you should read. I'm doing some publicity for the book, not mine, by Rama Bijolkar. It's called Lilliput Land. So she's a IMA professor. She argues that small is beautiful in India. I'm not going to that extent, but she gives a lot of information of how this informal economy has sort of morphed and adapted very well to the formal economy. For example, when Coca-Cola came into India in the early 90s, they thought that, they will transform the entire, Indian soft, drink scene. While they confronted a lot of these challenges which they did not have in the advanced markets. So similarly, the informal sector is very dynamic, and that's why they're very, they're very resistant. And they provide employment, but it's not sustainable employment, right? For example, how do you create, when you go to a daily wage laborer in any construction site, they don't have a contract. They don't have a labor contract, right? So they just go as a daily wage laborer. So how do you sort of institutionalize best practices, yet retaining some of these aesthetic elements within this Indic ecosystem is, again, I think, the way forward. Because you're being, again, sensitive to their needs. my last point is, I'm quite passionate about this. So my last point is, see, if say a Kirana shop goes bust, right? What is the first thing that they would do in the United States? They'll probably go to a bank and file for bankruptcy. In India, the first thing in Bharat they do is go to the family member. And someone in the family might go and try to help them finance and get this person out of the mess. The second port of calling would be some local person whom they have a good relationship with, who might offer a much higher rate, but they're comfortable with that local person who's providing financing. And then if these two things don't work out, then they go to the bank, right? So most of the informal sector is highly relationship driven, highly trust driven, highly community driven. So these are all nuances that one notices.
Just one point to add to that. So about 10% of the employment in India is by large companies, right? Like the MNCs, the Mahindras, the Reliance, the Adanis. 90% of employment is actually coming from MSMEs. And these MSMEs, so it's not just the daily wage laborers, the MSMEs are also not giving off informal contracts, and a lot of this informal labor and or people are coming from that sector. We have a lot of regulations for MSMEs, but very difficult to get them executed and implemented. There's not a consolidated effort, and I think we need a lot more governance. Even the CIIs and the Bombay Chamber of Commerce and all these conglomerates are also working only with the large companies. They have membership of the smaller MSMEs, but very difficult to get anything done through them.
Yeah, and this is going to be how any major economy, the bulk of employment is in the MSMEs. You can't expect the Reliances and Tatas to absorb all of that. I will say, I started a cafe in Delhi. We were just talking about it. It has 75 employees right now. A lot of them aren't on formal contracts because there are a crazy number of regulations and laws that need to be revisited before that makes economic sense, both for the employer as well as for the employee. So there is a lot of work that can be done there. A lot of states are being proactive in trying to bring the advantages of formal sector employment to people. But there's clearly, with 90% of the country in informal employment situations, as we just heard, there's clearly a lot more work to be done, particularly, I would say, on changing these laws.
Thank you so much. Can we please thank our panelists again?